This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Sports and Society podcast. Your hosts are Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Hey, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. I've been looking forward to this discussion for a while here.
Yeah, me too. This is an especially important episode that deals with a tremendously consequential issue in sports today, and that is politics around the inclusion of trans athletes, especially trans women athletes in competitive sports. This episode directly relates to an extended discussion we have in Chapter 7 on gender and sexuality, but it is also highly relevant to Chapter 13 on sports and politics. I should also say that we're recording this on July 29th, 2025, and I mention that because this is a terrain that is constantly shifting. So some of the things that our guests say today may be outdated if you're listening to this, even a month later, but definitely 6 months or a year from now, many things could have changed. But this is such a heated debate, and there's so much confusion on this topic. So we have invited two of the world's leading scholars on this topic to help us understand the complicated issues around defining sex and fairness in sports competition. Our first guest I'll introduce is Dr. Anna Baeth. She is the Vice President of Programs and Research at Athlete Ally, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing LGBTQI plus inclusion in sports. A former collegiate hockey coach and NCAA athlete, she brings both personal and professional experience to her work on equity in athletics. She is co-author of two forthcoming books, Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports from the New Press, and Queering Sport, Populism, and Isolationism, What's Happening with Trans Athletes and What It Says About Us from Rutgers University Press, a very good press, I can say. Drawing on her scholarship and advocacy, Dr. Baeth aims to support students and audiences in thinking critically about why the alleged debates around gender in sport matter for sport and society alike. We also have Dr. Madeleine Pape. She/her is a sociologist at the University of Lausanne's Institute of Social Sciences. Following her career as an Olympic athlete for Australia, Beijing Olympics athletics, for those in the U.S., that's track and field, 800 meters, she obtained her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research on regulation, gender, and integrity in sport is informed by her experience of competing alongside South African Olympic champion Caster Semenya at the 2009 World Championships in Berlin. Madeleine has worked with the International Olympic Committee for 3 years to support the rollout of the IOC framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations. Welcome, Beth and Madeleine.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. And just to note, I do go by my last name. It's Baeth. It sounds like faith with a B.
As we start here, I want to get right to the foundation that will help students think through some of these issues. And we're going to talk about sex versus gender in our vocabulary. And what I'd like each of you to address a little bit is your sense of the history of the use of gender in place of the word sex. So we know that sociologists have long used the terms sex role and gender role, but that is something that refers to cultural norms that identify expectations for males and females. And what we want to do now is move that discussion to the present and talk about what the implications are of using gender in place of sex, and why has that occurred in sociology in particular, but among others as well.
Sure. Thanks, Jay. Okay, so I think the term, as I understand it, gender, really emerged in the mid 20th century. And this was when feminist theorists and sociologists and psychologists really started to try to separate biological classifications or sex from the social and cultural roles and expectations of what we call gender. And I think that this history is quite actually long and interesting, especially when we look at second wave feminism, and more recently when we look at queer theory, which really emerged in the 1990s, and then trans theory, which has emerged over, I would say, the last decade or so. Through those theorizations, we've really started to think of gender more as part of language around social identity, and where we situate ourselves socially, while sex has always been sort of linked to this idea of biology. And that linkage is complicated. It's inaccurate in my estimation. But I think that kind of hopefully gives a little bit of history of how those two became distinct.
So, Madeline, do you have anything to add to that in terms of your experience in Switzerland and at the University of Lausanne and working with the IOC? When did their language change at all?
Well, actually, I'm going to choose not to respond specifically to your question, Jay, and maybe go back to my roots in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I was trained as a sociologist of gender, first and foremost, but also in a field that's called science and technology studies. And in both of those fields, there is a specific understanding of gender and also its relationship to this concept of sex. So as a gender sociologist, I actually don't use the word role, for example. So I'm from the Raywin Connell, lineage of sociology of gender. So for me, gender is a system of power. It is always relational. It is reproduced at the micro level in our relationships and interactions with other people, at the meso level in the organizational contexts that we inhabit, and then also at the institutional and societal level. So in the big institutions like politics, the economy, education, religion, and so on that structure social life. And gender is a structure that operates across all of these levels and defines very often the opportunities that are available to us, how we are perceived by others, but also resources and other very material things that we can experience or not, depending on our location within this system. Now, if I add to that the STS or science and technology studies perspective, what I have found very productive for my own work is to actually start to question this distinction between sex and gender that many sociologists did indeed insist on back in the 70s in particular, with sociologists like Oakley, for example, and Judith Lorber, who really leaned into gender as a way to push back against the idea that biology is destiny. So this was really trying to put biology out of the picture and making gender the focus of our analysis. And actually, feminist scholars who've been trained in the biological sciences have pushed back and said, but why are we leaving sex off the table here? There are many critical questions that we can ask about what this concept is, how knowledge is produced about it, to what extent it is truly binary, or this is just actually a product of ideology. So I am of the sort of the camp that likes to challenge the ways that we seek to distinguish sex from gender and actually understand both how they are entangled in our lived experience, in our own bodies. We can't really separate which parts are biology and which parts are influenced by our social context, but also recognize that we can bring a very, very strong gender analysis to the concept of biological sex and the ways that we use it and produce knowledge about it.
Yeah, and that takes us right into the dilemma being faced in many sports now, because sports have been organized around taken for granted physical distinctions or sexual distinctions between males and females in their vocabulary. And so the assumption is that any competitions that involve both men and women or boys and girls would be unfair. And so how do we deal with this in sport when we have a long history of this distinction? And what are the ways through which we can break through that distinction, I guess, is one of the questions. So what are your feelings about that in terms of challenges that you face, given your approaches to this vocabulary and to these distinctions?
Yeah, I mean, so like many students, I have grown up playing sport my whole life, and actually I've played almost exclusively sport in a sex segregated context. So with other women identified people, separate from people who identify as boys and men. That's always been my experience. And I can say that when I started to do my graduate studies in sociology and discover the debates about the concept of sex, the strict separation of women and men in sport, that I found it very confronting, actually. It was very challenging for me to start to ask some different questions about why is sport organized this way? Is there actually a biological justification for this? Is it more complex than a straightforward and simple biological explanation? And I guess what's been helpful for me has been to really understand the origins of this distinction between women and men in sport. And if you look at the origins, it was actually because sport was designed only for men. There was only one category, and that was the men's category. And the ways that women were able to negotiate access to this sporting world was by agreeing to participate in a separate category. Who did that serve? Well, some people will say that it served women because it gave them the opportunity to compete and be competitive for medals and success and so on. Other people, like Mary Jo Kane, who is a sociologist at the University of Minnesota, has argued, along with Travis and other sociologists, that actually men are very much served by this separation. And why? Because by separating women and men in sport, it allows us to leave in place this myth that men are universally better athletes than women. Now, anyone who's competed in or done some sport in a mixed gender setting will be able to tell you that it is much more complex than that. And there is always some degree of overlap between girls and boys, between women and men. But that overlap is a little inconvenient for the idea of men's physical superiority. So sex segregation is a way that we can leave in place this idea.
Yeah, Baith, can you tie, Madeline tied some of her ideas to her experiences in sport. And I'm wondering if your experiences in sport have informed what you've done in terms of your own research and in terms of your own involvement with Athlete Ally.
Yes, absolutely. So I grew up playing field hockey, which in the United States is primarily a women's sport. And so I say that because actually I would say my investigation into this really began more deeply after my PhD. So when I was finishing my PhD, I was hired at Athlete Ally, which is an advocacy organization focused on LGBTQ inclusion. And at the time, this was about 6 years ago, at the time, trans athletes weren't really in the conversation. And at the time, I think if you had asked me, well, what do you think about this topic? What do you think about gender and sex? I don't know that I would have, I don't really know what I would have said, frankly. And I say that because I was then ultimately sort of thrown into this world where we were having debates about the roles of gender, the roles of sex in sports systems. And I decided that I needed to do my own research. So I ended up going in and doing a reading of every study on testosterone, every study that I could find on how we test sex, what we know about it. And what I found was that the history is complicated. There have been so many ways that people have tried to distinguish men from women through specific tests. So there's genetic testing, there's chromosomal testing, there is visual inspection. There are really 6 or 7 different ways that we've tried to understand sex throughout history, and none have been definitive. And so when I realized that and started to think more critically about, okay, well, if we can't define these two sexes, then why are we defining sport in this way? And how have these systems been built based on this false premise and this false notion? And I think, much like Madeline, I've really spent the last 5 years considering, okay, so if this is what the sport system looks like right now, based on this premise, what else could it look like? What might it look like in other spaces? And I think I just to add to one other point that Madeline drew out, sex segregation has benefited men historically. But I think it's also important to note that while women, and I think there's a new book out, it came out this year by Cherie Becker and Stephen Mumford, that talks a little bit about this. So while women have been included in sports systems, we're still hundreds of years behind in terms of understanding how sport might benefit women. And so there are I think it's important to consider the temporal component of this as well, and recognizing that these sports systems have only been in place for, not too long, but women or women's sports are still playing catch up.
So both of you have raised a question for me, because a lot of my scholarship has been historical. And so I tend to think a lot about historical context and how changes in the historical context shuts down opportunities. Certain things make more sense. Certain values get defined differently. So one of the values we've raised just now is fair and fairness. But fairness is not some absolute concept. It's a concept that changes over time. In different times, in different places, and even across different groups, we can use the same value. We could all adhere to the same value of fairness, but define it very differently. So I'm wondering, as we think about, in say the 19th century, when sports was a male domain, and then in the 20th century, what changed that opened up opportunities for women to participate in sport? And suddenly we're now saying sport is good for women too, right? We used to say, oh, it's bad for women. Now it's good for women. And then in the present time, why are we turning to science to define these things? What is it going on in society and culture now that's the logical way in which we define? We're trying to settle a political discussion.
I think first, the point is this is political, right? I mean, there is a reason we're having this conversation. There is a reason it's all over the news. And I might argue that this is not necessarily a political discussion as much as it is a politicized discussion. When we look at trans athletes and the history of trans athletes and even these constructs of fairness, trans athletes have been around for hundreds of years, right? I mean, they've always existed. And I also just want to say trans athletes have historically made up a very, very small portion of the sporting population. And this is true today. Currently within the United States, trans athletes make up about a half of 1% of all athletes, and that's at all levels. So not a lot has changed in some ways, right? I mean, trans folks have been around, they're still around. So this really raises the question, okay, of well, what has changed? Then why are we having this conversation right now? Why is this becoming such a huge topic? And I think the media would have you think that it's likely because of people like, say, Leah Thomas. Leah Thomas was an NCAA swimmer, a trans woman who competed a few years ago. She won a couple of races. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, we have to talk about trans athletes. But it's also important to know, I think, layering on the political context around that, I don't think it was about Leah Thomas. I think it was about a political moment. And Leah Thomas actually had been competing for some time before she was really in the news. But it wasn't until right before the legislative sessions in 2021, so this is when all of the state policymakers get together and start making decisions, that all of a sudden everybody's talking about Leah Thomas. And so then I think, well, who's doing the talking? What are they saying? And again, why now? And I think the Leah Thomas example is a great example of all of a sudden, we weren't actually hearing from sports people. We were hearing from politicians about Leah Thomas at a particular moment when certain politicians are gearing up to be reelected. And so again, this really raises some questions for me around, okay, who is benefiting from this conversation?
Yeah, and I think, this relates back to our vocabulary issue in a way, because the people who raised this issue, Beth, as you're pointing out, were using a sex binary. I mean, they were making this distinction, a non-overlapping distinction between what they saw as males and females. And in the meantime, however, there had been research done that showed that sex really doesn't fit neatly into a binary, that it really fits into a concept of a spectrum. And that made it closer to the way people had looked at gender. And so what's happened is that we're stuck between a binary and a spectrum in this politicized moment. And the people who are calling for bans are using the binary as a basis for their decision. And the people who are calling for inclusion are using a spectrum and then thinking about how fairness can be achieved within this spectrum. So Madeline, do you see it that way, or do you look at it differently?
I guess what we're talking about here are some really foundational beliefs in sport. So one is that fairness. So fairness is a defining value of fairness is this kind of concept that we learn about when we get involved in sport as younger people. We really inculcated with this value, and we firmly believe that there can be such a thing as fairness in sport, that this is what sport is about, this is what it strives for, this is what we learn about when we're in sport. When in fact, of course, if we start to break it down, as Jeff, you mentioned earlier, well, in the end, there isn't really stable ground here. The concept of fairness is often in the eye of the beholder. And of course, certain things don't come into that fairness equation at all. For example, is it fair that one athlete from one country might have access to a huge amount of resources and the world's best sports science in their preparation for the Olympic Games, whereas another athlete might barely be able to to get to the Olympic Village and doesn't have the same national support behind it. That's just one example. But of course, we don't ask that question in sport. So there's a lot of blind spots in the ways that we construct the concept of fairness, and that is to the advantage of certain groups. I would say it's the same when it comes to gender disparities in sport. Now, it would be great to see the same energy that we're currently seeing towards transgender athletes actually being put on the question of gender disparities in sport and the fact that in many sports, women continue to be underfunded relative to men, to have far fewer opportunities to compete professionally. We're not talking about the same game when we're talking about sports like football, for example, even basketball. Women and men simply do not have the same opportunities to develop and succeed in their sports. So that could be a question of fairness, and yet that also doesn't enter this conversation. And instead, I think we can get fixated on what we believe is some other truth that sport shows us, this truth that apparently men are universally better athletes than women, and that this is biology and not influenced by factors such as gender inequalities. And that this is also a truth that many of us really hold on to because of how much we've been exposed to that idea, and as we've gone through sport, because of how much the organization of sport has just confirmed that idea for us. I think what happens is that we actually can become quite emotionally attached to that idea as well, just because it seems to, I guess, tell us something about the truth of our own experiences in sport. And I think that that's where it gets uncomfortable for people, to be able to actually have that distance from take that distance from their own experiences, have some critical reflection about why do I hold these ideas about fairness and its apparent link to sex? Like, where does this come from? Why do I believe that? And what evidence am I even basing this on? And what are perhaps the examples in my own experience that might actually trouble that idea? This is, I think, to Anna's point that it's not necessarily a scientific question. I would say it's more than a political question. I think it's very much a subjective, emotional question or emotional experience for people, because it's touching on something that feels like it's so foundational to our own lived experiences, and which sport has very often confirmed for us.
Yeah, and in this politicized moment, what has happened is that people have seized on this one-dimensional approach to fairness, and all of the other fairness issues, and as you have suggested, related to gender, have been pushed into the background, and they are probably affecting the participation of girls and women in sport much more than anything related to the trans issue. And so that's an important thing, this politicized moment has ignored all of those other things and shifted the discussion in a way that has benefited men in a sense and in a real sense. So, Beth, you have...
Yeah, and I just want to add, I as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking about a report that came out a few years ago from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. And it was an analysis of all of the literature on trans women athletes. So what they did, and what I find really interesting, is that they looked at peer-reviewed research, and they also looked at gray literature. So some policy reports. But the compelling part of this report for me is they didn't just look at the quote-unquote science of sex. They also looked at a lot of what we're talking about here around the social constructions of sport. So what actually makes someone a great athlete? Is it certain genes, or is it having access and resources and coaching? And I think what's compelling about this report is it brings this idea of the science of sex and what I might consider sort of the cultural and social constructions around gender and sport into conversation. And they really bring up this point of when we look at policy, when we look at these discussions, there is an extreme overemphasis on biology. There is an overemphasis on how we're thinking about biology and sex. And I point this out because I think it's a resource that most people might not know about. So I wanted to bring that to the attention of the students. But I also think it's an interesting read as a sociologist if you're considering how are our disciplines in conversation with each other or not. And I think the topic of trans athletes is one where, in my estimation, this is a beautiful moment when we can start having some more serious conversations about, I think to Madeline's earlier point, about sex versus gender, and how we're thinking about these and how we can have conversations that cross interdisciplinary boundaries.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues here is what sports or which sports count. And, here we're talking about history, and it's men's sports that count, and for the most part, and that has influenced the discussion of sex and gender in connection with sport. So we're talking about a particular historical moment here where women's sports are becoming increasingly popular, and now we're raising serious kinds of questions that distract us from that process and what needs to happen to keep it moving that way. And so that's part of the politics of this that carries over into sport. And I'm wondering, in terms of the strategies for dealing with this, at the non-elite levels, there have been various kinds of modifications in sports and different priorities about what sports count in people's lives. So we have golf with handicaps, we have bowling with handicaps, and these are not male-female issues. These are ability issues to keep people involved in a competitive sport that's good for them, that is enjoyable, and that brings people together regardless of some of their background and some of their personal characteristics. So I'm wondering, can we learn from what's going on at that level? And does any of that have relevance for what might exist on the elite level? And, I've watched these Scottish Highland Games, and they have an unbelievably sophisticated way of bringing men and women, people of different ages, into the same competition. The 100-meter dash, for example, that I watched, with a 60-year-old man competing against a man who was the lead sprinter on their Olympic team, the high school 100-meter champion, the woman champion from college, a woman from the Olympic team, and they were all in the same race. But they were starting from different points on the basis of previous times that they had registered in formal competitions. So the race began with the gun, and the 60-year-old man won, but everyone crossed the finish line within a second and a half. So it was close, and the formula worked, and it brought people together in the same event. So my sense is then, can we do that? I mean, is that even possible in elite sports?
Actually, we have a similar example in Australia. So we have what's called professional athletics, as in professional track, and it's conducted on grass tracks, often cricket ovals, actually, that have been converted into tracks. And it's everyone has a handicap. based on their ability. And so you can have like a 400-meter race that has the Olympic champion, which was Kathy Freeman back in the day, off scratch, the furthest back. And then you could have like a woman in her 50s starting 60 meters further around. And then it was a race, they start at the same time. That's a race to the finish. And that also enabled, like in that case, we also had mixed gender races as well. But yeah, it's very entertaining. And one of our biggest sporting events is called the Stall Gift, and it's this exact mode of racing. It's professional track and field, but what that means is handicapped racing. So yeah, there are all kinds of models that are possible. I think one distinction. So I think I would just maybe make a distinction I hope is helpful. I think on the one hand, we're talking about how to challenge this very rigid binary way of thinking about differences between women and men, like how to start to break down this idea that, men are performing over here, women are performing over there, that there's no overlap, that there is daylight between the sporting abilities of women and men, and how to start to break that down and create opportunities to actually see the overlap that exists. One example actually that Mary Jo Kane used in her article in the Sporting Continuum was I think it was in Minneapolis, and it was the marathon, the city's annual marathon. And if you look at the results of any marathon, you're going to see that there is a huge amount of overlap between the performances of women and men over the same distance. So this is one question, to what extent is sporting performance between cisgender women and men, so women who have always identified as women since they were born and men the same, to what extent is it actually a binary situation, or how can we actually start to break it down and make it and reveal actually that it's much more complex than that? I think the second question, though, which is a different question altogether, is how to understand the performance capabilities of trans athletes. And that's not the same question, actually. It's an entirely separate question, because a trans woman is not comparable to a cisgender man. In fact, scientific research has shown that even in the case of transgender women who haven't taken steps to medically affirm their gender, already their sporting performances are poorer than those of cisgender men. So we're simply not talking about cisgender men when we're talking about transgender women. So we can sort of put that debate to one side, even though I think it helps us start to maybe break down some of our assumptions about sex. This debate about, should women's and men's sport be separate? Is there actually a difference? And then we can ask a very different set of questions about, okay, now what's going on in the case of trans athletes? What do we know about athletic performance in transgender athletes? And what is, I think, unfortunate in the current environment is that second conversation very often gets cut short, and we absolutely have not seen that conversation through to really truly understand the diversity of athletic ability in the trans population, and where and to what extent there are opportunities for trans athletes to participate in elite.
Yeah, and I think that the research has certainly not caught up there in terms of looking at the abilities of trans athletes, and there are some methodological issues here in terms of getting control groups and comparison groups and doing research over time. And as Beth pointed out, this issue is only a decade old, and the research hasn't, and the research grants, for example, have not caught up in terms of funding the longitudinal research that's really needed to help people understand this diversity that you're talking about, Madeline. And that's something that we really need to focus on in not just sociology, but in physiology and exercise science, and get the research moving. So, but one of the things that I've thought of is that if young people from the get-go have had more and more experience in gender-integrated events, that they would be much more open to considering all sorts of mixes that are now being seen as unfair. And the Olympics, by the way, now has relay races that include teams consisting of a man and a woman, and men and women, and we're starting to see that in other events. I know that some high schools have used swimming, where they take a sum of the men's times and a sum of the women's times on a particular team, and then compare that grand total to figure out the winner. And now that's not gender integrated in the same way, but we're talking about preparing young people for adulthood. I mean, in most of our experiences, our sport groups and training are gender integrated, and in our high schools and our universities, we're not preparing students for that. We've got this gender segregated system that has led them to have an approach that makes them wonder if the gender integration is really the way to go. And I'm thinking gender integration ought to start in preschool, and it ought to go right through college with a modification of our sport forms. So do either of you think that would be successful in preparing people for dealing with the trans issue in particular, but gender integration and issues related to sex and gender in general?
I just wanted to respond directly to what you've just said, Jay, because I think one very important point is that sex-segregated sport actually reinforces sexist attitudes and behaviors from men to women. So women, men basically and numerous studies have shown this, that when men practice sport in male-dominated environments, it only reaffirms the idea that women are inferior, not only physically, but also in terms of their leadership skills, in terms of their intelligence in a given sport. So even, their ability to coach as well as male coaches. Sex segregation contributes to these sexist beliefs and practices towards women. So women have everything to gain by exploring alternative models of sports participation.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, there is limited research, but what we know is also when we keep trans and non-binary athletes out of both men's and women's sports, those same perceptions are manifest in both spaces. Cisgender girls actually report feeling safer, more included, report that they have more fun participating in sport when they participate in sport spaces that have policies and cultural practices that are inclusive of non-binary and trans athletes. And what we found too, there was a recent study, it came out last summer, that was looking at cisgender boys and men's perceptions of themselves when they hear anti-trans rhetoric. And what they report is essentially more internalized toxic masculinity. So they are much harsher on themselves about how they perform gender, how cis boys and cis men perform gender when they hear anti-trans rhetoric. And so I think it's really important to highlight that this is potentially harming all groups of athletes. Segregation in these ways is harmful for all people, or has the capacity to be. And I think that's something we don't necessarily talk about.
So, Madeline and Beth, you're raising so many fascinating points. I'm really loving this discussion. And it's deeply sociological, your discussion of social construction. Beth, you hinted at the idea of moral panic, that much of this is a moral panic. And moral panic is just the idea that there are social fears that are inconsistent with the actual risk a society faces. And within that, it's generally created in the media. And within that, there's what's called a folk devil, the object that generates this moral panic, this unrealistic fear. And in this case, as Beth, you really well argued, it's the trans athlete, in particular trans women athletes, who are they're so few, right? And they're not disrupting the world that we live in, but because our world is so constructed, right, we fear that things can be disrupted. Now, one of the things that as intellectuals, right, we engage in systematic research. We organize our theoretical perspectives, we have our methodological approach, and we want our decisions to be our analysis to be based on a rational analysis of empirical data, and that's going to inform an effective policy. And what I hear you talking about right now is the possible effective policies. But Beth, as you said, this isn't just political, it's politicized, right? There's this moral panic. So how much opportunity do you think we have for rational political solutions to a contemporary social problem? And what might be some avenues we could pursue to successfully achieve these empirically informed, rational policies?
I think I would say certainly this is a moral panic. And I think we've seen that most readily. One case in point of this is what we've seen happening in sport governing bodies. So just recently, the USOPC changed their policy around trans athletes. But I actually think one of the best examples of how we can do this more critically is from the IOC. And on that point, I'm going to turn it over to Madeline, if you would be willing to tell us a little bit more about the IOC's framework, most recent framework around this, and how that process was established.
Yeah, so I've had this great privilege in the past few years to work with the International Committee, and the IOC had taken this quite extraordinary step back in 2021 of updating their policy position on both trans athletes and athletes with sex variations to insist that international sports organizations should consider not only scientific considerations, but also human rights concerns, and especially the potential harms to athletes that can result from eligibility regulations. And, in the cases of both trans athletes and athletes with intersex variations, their situations are often different, but there can be very, very important human rights questions to ask in relation to both groups. And women with intersex variations in particular, we know, thanks to reports like that the Human Rights Watch produced back in 2020, that a large number of women, and very often actually women from the Global South, have really suffered under the implementation of eligibility rules. And the idea behind the IOC framework was that, sport was going to reckon with this. Sports organizations were going to take all of these factors into account before deciding on what would actually be a reasonable policy approach. So that this sort of determination of what is reasonable would include both consideration of existing scientific research, but also how any regulations might harm really put some athletes in extremely different situations. I would say that, I can certainly share more. I've really been impacted actually by the firsthand stories of, especially women from the Global South who've been affected by eligibility rules, but also by the firsthand stories from trans athletes in Global North countries who've talked about the amount of harassment that they've experienced. And also actually sometimes, really positive stories about just how meaningful it was for them to actually be able to participate in sport, and how much it helped them to build a social network, to find their place in the world, to really feel affirmed in who they are and have their identity recognized. Sport has such a positive role to play. So all of these elements were built into this IOC framework. I would say what ended up being extremely challenging on the ground was actually trying to support international federations to put that framework into practice. Many international federations are very small. They have very few staff. They have a very limited budget. They have limited capacity really to undertake a very involved, lengthy, complicated process that really digs into this topic that is, there's a lot of stigma around it. So there's so much to overcome to actually get a federation to put a really comprehensive process into place, especially one that centers the voices of the athletes that are impacted by eligibility rules. And I think, in fact, there's what we've now seen is that there's a real mismatch between where international sports federations are at, both politically and also the political will from their stakeholders, but just also where they're at from a resource point of view, and what the IOC framework was asking of them. In a way, it was almost too ambitious for where sports organisations were at. And they really just needed something much more practical. They just sort of wanted to be told what to do rather than have to go on a learning experience, even if that journey of learning about the complexity of this topic has the potential to be so enriching for a sports organisation.
Yeah, to amplify your point, Melanie, the Caster Semenya story is still going on. And this has been how many years now? 8 or 9 years. And things are still not worked out. And this relates to your point on athletes from the Global South, and especially athletes of color that don't fit into contemporary Western definitions related to physical appearance and sex, for example, and just self-presentational issues. So, and that then, for the people who view things in terms of a sex binary, raises alarm bells when they see an athlete that doesn't fit into the binary as they have learned it. So and that has trapped Caster Semenya into this never-ending legal situation where she's going from one courtroom to another, and with her lawyers trying to say, look, everyone doesn't fit into the way things have been defined, and we've got to figure out ways to be inclusive and fair. And her case is really a standard here that, or hopefully will lead to some kinds of decisions that will create a more inclusive standard. And that's just one case. And I know we're short of time now, but are there any things that either of you would like to say in terms of your hope or strategy or optimism, pessimism about where things are going in terms of fairness and inclusion and the trans athlete issue?
I have a theoretical response to start as a true sociologist here. So is something that I've been really thinking about a lot lately. I mentioned earlier sort of this interdisciplinary approach and some recent trans theory. There is a beautiful piece. It's called Cruising Utopia, written by Jose Esteban Munoz. And it really, the theoretical framework that he puts forward is the idea that if we were to center joy and focus our efforts on joy, our construction of the systems around us would fundamentally shift. And I've been thinking a lot about joy and finding joy and healing in sport. And I know that this is theoretical, of course, but something that I consistently go back to, both, from a theoretical sociological perspective, and from my perspective as a human who loves being in my body and moving, is just the idea of how can we reconsider this through a framework of joy and creating healthful spaces. So that's my first heady response. And Madeline, if you have a response, please feel free. And I have a logistical sort of on the ground response too.
Well, I don't have a response per se, but I guess I would add some other elements that I think are important. For me, so what I think is the most concerning part of how debates about trans athletes are unfolding, especially in the US, but also in some other places, like the UK in particular, has very, very challenging environment at the moment for trans people. And international sport, I would say, is also very, very challenging. And what I see missing in those environments is very often just curiosity. People come into the debate assuming they know all they need to know, not willing to shift from that position, not willing to hear a different perspective. And I mean, this is a problem that goes far beyond just debates about trans people and sport. It's it's a wider problem that I think we really need to wrestle with. But I think you really see it come to the surface with this topic. For example, I very often hear people say with absolute conviction that the science on trans athletes is clear. Either they will be arguing that the science is clear that there is retained advantage in trans women and there is nothing more to see here, no more science needed. Or it might also be people saying there is no advantage in trans women, there is no more science needed. And in both cases, I would say they're wrong. Like it is just too soon to say what scientific research can tell us about athletic performance in trans athletes and including trans women. And what bothers me the most, though, is the people who say they base their opinion on science, but then don't actually want science to happen. And we see this happen a lot, actually. There have been numerous studies in the UK that have been shut down because they were going to be investigating athletic performance in trans athletes. I know it's become increasingly difficult in the US context as well to do this kind of research. And I think that's such a shame. It means we will never know the answer to the question of what does athletic performance look like in trans athletes? How does it vary from one individual to another? Like what's the diversity that exists in the trans population? Let's get it out there. Let's understand. Let's inquire. And the lack of scientific curiosity is very troubling to me, because it's very often the same people who use the language of science to justify their opinion. And then a second space where I think that curiosity is very much needed is just in actually hearing directly from trans people. So many cisgender people have an opinion on trans women and their right to be present in women's sport. And they don't even know a trans person, let alone a trans woman, let alone a trans woman athlete. So it's a debate that happens in the abstract very often, or sometimes someone will have like, oh, well, I know one person, and therefore I know all I need to know about trans people. It's challenging to actually hear directly from trans people because they're not actually that big a proportion of the population, and they're even smaller in the context of sport. Like they're underrepresented at all levels of sport. So it's not surprising that people don't actually have firsthand experiences of meeting a trans person and especially competing alongside a trans person. But I so firmly believe that we have so much to gain from those encounters, and that we have to make the effort to actually seek out those encounters and hear about the lives of trans people and understand what competing in sport means for their lives.
Yeah, I have found it so curious that this has been such a polarizing topic, and it seems like it is polarizing to the point that we can't have conversation. I've certainly found that to be the case in my work, and I think it's actually incredibly important for students to recognize that it's contentious, and you don't have to be on one side or the other, right? It's complicated, and your opinion and your perspective can and probably should shift. I alluded a little bit to my own experience in this work, and my perspective on this has shifted drastically as I've learned more. But I think, something that I find really curious about this too is how emotional this is. To Madeline's point about how sport is, for most of us, an emotional experience. I think that's true for people who are advocating on both sides of this argument too. It feels very emotional. It feels very fraught. And something that I've struggled with as an advocate and as a scholar is the sense of anti-intellectualism that we are seeing. And I don't know that I can speak to this globally, but within the United States in particular, it seems to me, and I've done some research on this, when we talk about facts, when we talk about the number of trans athletes, when I talk about, who is talking about this and who's not talking about it, the reaction is even more polarizing. There are people who will look at data and say, I don't care, I don't believe this. I firmly attest that trans women should never be allowed in sport. And that is something that I don't think we've had to confront in terms of political movements or social movements before. And I think it's coming through in sport in very particular ways, which is part of the irony for me then of why people are so obsessed with science and what we know and what we don't know, because the literature that's out there is, the scientific literature is pretty terrible. So it's an interesting moment of, I don't know that we're being curious enough. I think there is a real pushback against intellectual curiosity, and I don't know how to confront that. And the only way that I can continue to do so is to say, I love sport. I care about sport. I want everybody to have access to this in some form or fashion. And if we can't start there, then I don't know where we're going to go.
So I'm thinking about some potential students, listeners to this podcast who they're not sociology majors. Maybe they're a kinesiology major of some type, or they're a sport management major, or maybe they're in an education program. But they're taking a class where sports and society is assigned, and this particular potential listener, right? They're thinking that they're going to get a job working in the sports field. They'll hope for probably a elite level professional franchise, or maybe with an Olympic, a National Olympic Committee, something like that. But they're very likely going to end up working in schools, in municipal sports systems, something of that nature. First, if there are so few trans athletes, why should they care about this question? And two, what in their role as a person that's actually working in sports, what can they do, assuming they do care, right? That inclusion is important to them. What kinds of practical things would they be able to do in that position?
So as somebody who also works in sport, I'm a collegiate coach as well. Sport provides an immense opportunity to interact with people who are not like us. And I find that most people who love sport, that's one of the parts of sport that they do love. So I think first it's figuring out, to Madeline's point, how do we learn from each other? And how does sport serve as a facilitator for that? To the question of why care about trans athletes if there are so few, we're talking about trans athletes right now, but I would imagine these conversations are not so different than conversations that were had and have been had over the years about cis women athletes compared to cis men, about Black athletes compared to white athletes, particularly I'm thinking of the United States. So sport is a space where we can question and think about. I often think about how culture is seeping into our sporting systems. So why care? I mean, I think this is an example, a contemporary example of many different issues that your students will read about in the textbook. And what can we do? Well, there are a lot of resources out there. I work for Athlete Ally. We have a series of resources. There are plenty of folks who are doing this work and who can offer advice. That said, I think the first thing you do is try to talk to trans athletes and figure out what they want. I get a lot of calls from people saying, well, how do I support my trans athletes? And I say, well, how do they want to be supported? I think you start with that conversation.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Thanks for this exciting conversation. I especially want to thank Beth and Madeline for coming on and providing their expertise on what is an emotionally charged, very complicated, very confusing discussion. I hope that this was able to provide some clarity and some guidance for people. And what do you think? What's your thoughts on this? If you want to join in the conversation, we've got a Discord server, Sports and Society Discord server. There's a link to the Discord server in the description of this episode. So jump on the Discord and join in the conversation. And we'll look forward to talking to you on our next episode.